One day, a poor widow told her parish priest that she regularly saw the poor souls. The souls requested that she tell the priest about the visits to promote devotion to them. The woman was in her 50s when she got her first apparition. Her husband had died 8 years before. He had died of cancer, and during his sickness, he was often impatient and reproached God. One evening, she heard a voice. She wasn't able to recognize it, but every evening from then on, she continued to hear this voice. Over a long period of time, she suddenly was able to recognize the voice of her husband. Immediately, she knelt down to pray the rosary for his soul. She remembered his impatience and thought to herself, "Is this why he's still doing penance?" One night, she saw an apparition of a soul. It was hazy and foggy. Frightened, she immediately took some holy water and threw it at the apparition, saying, "O Lord, give him eternal rest." Then she ran to the door to escape to her neighbors, when she heard the voice of her husband say, "Ruth, don't be afraid. It's me. I have permission to come here to ask your help. Pray 3 chaplets each day, and don't tell anybody. They wouldn't speak well of it." Then he was gone. So every day Ruth prayed 3 chaplets for her husband. At the end of each chaplet, she added, "Good God, forgive my husband his impatience when he suffered." Some weeks later, he appeared to Ruth again. This time, she's able to recognize him in bodily form. He looks like he did when she first met him, except that now he's radiant and he smiled at her with a friendliness that she never saw from him during his life. She said to him, "How are you, Jacob?" He answered, "I'm fine. I may go home soon. I thank you, Ruth. I thank you so much." When he was alive, he had never thanked her for anything. He looked at her so sweetly that Ruth wanted to hug him. He stopped her and said, "Later, Ruth. One day it shall be wonderful. Now I'm allowed to tell you only one thing. There are others who also want to come to you. They have permission. God gave it to them. You can help them. Don't reject them, and don't be afraid. Never be afraid." He never appeared to her again, and Ruth realized that he had gone to heaven. For a long time, no souls came to her. During that time, her only son, Jacob, named after his father, was killed on the battlefield in Poland. While she prayed for the poor souls, she would always ask them how her son was, but she never got an answer. Then one day, while she was cleaning the house, an old woman appeared to her. The woman was so ugly that at first, Ruth wasn't sure if it was a poor soul or a demon. She was barely able to discern who this woman was, but she thought she looked a lot like her grandmother, who had died many years before. Ruth remembered what her husband said, so she wasn't afraid. The old woman said nothing, so Ruth said, "Who are you then? I don't know who you are." The old woman said in a voice that sounded more eerie than human, "You do know me." Ruth said, "If it were possible, I would say you are Grandma Joanna." The woman responded, "Yes, that's me, your grandma." Ruth said, "Well, dear Grandma, tell me what I can do for you." Grandma Joanna said, "You can do a lot for me. Pray every day a chaplet, especially for me, and be really good to the poor and when someone needs help." She then vanished. Ruth remembered how her grandmother had been harsh and critical of others, always scolding people. She hadn't particularly liked praying either and did very little of it. So Ruth prayed her chaplet every day and went to Mass every day as well, although it was hard to fit all of this in with her chores that needed to be done in the barn and at home. A few months later, her grandmother appeared to her again. This time she didn't look as old or wrinkled or ugly anymore, and she even smiled. St. Catherine of Genoa, who also helped the poor souls, said that as the rust of sin disappears, the soul becomes more loving. Ruth said, "Dear Grandma, how are you? You look fine." Grandma Joanna smiled and said, "I thank you, sweet Ruth. You have helped me so very much. At first my way up was so terribly long and so full of stones that I almost despaired. But now it is not so far anymore. I thank you, Ruth." About to leave, she turned back and said, "You have always asked how it is with your son Jacob. You need not worry about him. This one is already together on high. He was lying a whole night in a shell crater, severely wounded. Then he called to Jesus if he might put his wounds in the wounds of Jesus. That is the way he died. His guardian angel was permitted to bring him up to heaven straight away. His death was a death of sacrifice, taking part of the sacrifice of Jesus. Dying is beautiful if you love Jesus. At this news, Ruth wept with joy and said, "Grandma, thank you so much for telling me this." She reached out to clasp her grandmother's hand, but her grandmother stopped her lovingly, saying, "You need not worry about me anymore, but others will come. Don't be afraid." And with that, Ruth never saw her again. 8 days later, Ruth was feeding the pigs when she suddenly became aware of a man sitting at a table near her. He had the hardened look of a criminal, but Ruth knew at once that he was a poor soul. She said to him, "What do you want then?" He said in a voice that sounded like he was suffocating, "Help, help, I need." She asked, "How can I help you?" "Be good, think good, speak good, do good, be good, and give me whatever good you do." He disappeared. Ruth didn't know this soul and decided he must be a complete stranger. She surmised that since he asked her to offer all her good deeds, that he must have been hard during his life and gave no love. During this time, other souls came, and they too had many requests. Ruth ate nothing but sour milk and potatoes, and the rest of the food she gave away. When she thought she could do no more, she saw that the poor souls accommodated her. No more of them are allowed to come than she can cope with. Ruth did good with her farm animals too. One day, a relative came to visit her and told her about his hard times and how he needed a cow. She had a little calf that she had grown very fond of and was thinking of keeping for herself. But she thought of the soul with a hardened face and said, "Would you like the calf?" Her relative said he would, but he had no way of paying her just yet. Ruth waved her hands away and told him that it would be fine and to pay when he could. But as time went by, she began to wonder if he would be able to pay her back at all. But then she decided it didn't matter, because it was a sacrifice for the poor soul who had asked her for good deeds. After some time of doing good deeds, fasting and praying, the man appeared to her again. This time he looked much better, the hardness was gone, and he looked like a good-natured soul. She asked him, "Now, good man, are you satisfied with my goodness?" He bowed to her and said, "You have helped me a lot with your good deed. All hard slugs have fallen from my heart. Now my way isn't hopeless anymore. I thank you." One time, a soul of a mother appeared to her, looking ragged and like she had been crying. She seemed to be looking for her 5 children. Ruth learned that during her life, the mother had neglected to give her children any sort of religious education, and now she had to suffer from the terrible feeling that they were lost for eternity by her fault. Ruth worked hard to atone for this sin by giving extra religious instruction to the children of the village. 2 months later, the soul of the mother appeared to her again. She told Ruth that she was allowed to see her children from afar and did not need to be afraid of losing them anymore. From these visits from the poor souls, Ruth learned much about them and about purgatory. She learned that many proud souls go to hell, and if they are saved, their purgatory is enkindled by the humility and love for Christ. This humility of Christ works in them as a blaze of fire that burns until in the end all pride has melted away. The living can help by offering up humiliations for proud souls. The poor souls also send their own guardian angels to help their benefactors on earth. Ruth said, "The poor souls may help us through their guardian angels. They are allowed to help us often so effectively that all of us can in fact notice it. We should just pay attention to it. This, of course, is permitted only by the will of God." One time, Ruth was watching 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. When she went to church one day, she left the children at home, and while she was gone, the kids got restless and one of the boys hung from the kerosene lamp that was hanging from the ceiling. The lamp fell down and the kerosene spread all over the floor. The little girl had been holding a blanket, and when it got singed, she threw it away from her on the floor. When Ruth came home, she found that the kerosene had spread just a little bit away from the blanket, but the fire had not spread. For this, Ruth thanked the holy souls and their angels for preserving the house and the children from a fatal fire. The poor souls also told Ruth to pass on this warning. Many people are heading straight for purgatory. They live until their last hour, even on their deathbed, like everything is all right, but they don't use their time to call on the mercy of God. If they did this, they could spare themselves at least a very severe purgatory. Many people say that they often feel the presence of their loved ones after they die. An Amsterdam clinical psychologist found that out of 300 people that he interviewed, 20 to 25% said that they sometimes felt the deceased near them or even saw them. Could this presence be meant to comfort the living relatives or to remind them that they are in need of prayer? Ruth has an answer for this from one particular poor soul who complained to her. You and the world have no inkling of what we have to suffer. Being abandoned and forgotten by those who have been nearest to us in the world, that is the most bitter. Sometimes they stand at the tombs of our decayed bodies and don't pray for us at all. They act as if we don't exist anymore. God's justice commands us to be silent, but we stand at the door of their houses, of our former dwellings, and wait. We stand there and wait. Days, years. We wait for them to give us a small sign of their love by prayer and sacrifices, but we stay there in vain. We cry in vain for love, for help. Tell them through the priest, love should not die at death. We are still alive and we are hungry for love. For your love,